Welcome to this explainer on medieval England. We're looking at the crucial years between 1189 and 1216. A new king is about to be crowned, and the kingdom he inherits runs on a massive, complex machine built entirely on land, loyalty, and obligation. Everything connects. To really master this key topic for your GCSE revision, you need to understand how that machine worked, who pulled the levers, and what life was actually like for the people caught inside it. I'm joined today to help break this down. Let's get straight into the core theme of land and loyalty.
Here is our exact revision roadmap. We're going to cover the feudal hierarchy and the church, kingship looking at Richard versus John, government and royal finances, English society, the Jewish communities, and finally, some essential exam connections.
Section 1. The feudal hierarchy and the church. Medieval English society was built on a single, inescapable principle. You received land in exchange for providing a service. Think of it like a chain of command. The king owned all the land at the very top. He granted massive estates to his tenants-in-chief, meaning the barons and bishops. They swore an oath of homage and owed him knight service. They then passed land down to knights in exchange for military duty, and the knights passed land down to peasants.
Wait, so if a peasant owes physical labor service, what did that actually mean for them on a day-to-day basis?
It meant brutal physical exhaustion. They had to work the Lord's fields for a fixed number of days every single week, completely unpaid, and that was on top of trying to farm their own tiny strips of land just to survive.
But if a powerful lord had all these knights and all this land, what stopped him from just ignoring the king entirely? That is where forfeiture comes in. If a lord failed to provide his knights or decided to rebel, the king could legally seize his lands permanently. It was a constant threat hanging over every nobleman in England, which basically forced them to comply.
Where did the church fit into a system built on land and knights? Did they have to provide soldiers too?
Well, the church owned roughly a third of all the land in England. That made them incredibly powerful tenants-in-chief. They ran the schools, the hospitals, and they supplied the literate clerks who kept the government running. But crucially, bishops and abbots answered to two masters. They answered to the English king and to the Pope in Rome. When those loyalties clashed, the entire kingdom felt the shockwaves.
Section 2. Kingship. Richard versus John.
Being king wasn't just a title, it was a sacred role. The coronation involved being anointed with holy oil, which essentially transformed their authority into something divine. Let's see how our two kings handled this immense power.
How could two brothers rule so differently? Richard seems like a completely different species of king compared to John.
They really were exact opposites. Richard I had an unchallenged claim and a fearsome military reputation, but he spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. To him, England was essentially a giant bank account to fund his crusades. John, however, was constantly present in England. He involved himself heavily in the daily administration, but his interventions were arbitrary, vindictive, and unpredictable. That behavior bred massive resentment among his barons.
Why was John so insecure about his claim in the first place? Because of his nephew, Arthur of Brittany. Arthur actually had a very strong legal claim to the throne. Then, by 1203, Arthur mysteriously vanished. Contemporary sources firmly believe John ordered his murder. The immediate consequence was catastrophic for John. His reputation in France was completely destroyed, and his continental allies abandoned him.
Section 3. Government and royal finances.
How did England even function with Richard away for 10 years? Surely the whole system would just collapse without the king present.
You'd think so, but while the king was the heart, the government was a robust machine built by Richard's father. The solution was the justiciars. These were senior royal ministers who ruled in the king's name. The most famous was Hubert Walter. Under his direction, taxes were collected and justice was administered perfectly well without Richard ever setting foot in the country.
How did the king actually pay for all this administration plus his wars?
He relied on 4 main streams. First, the royal domain. This was the king's own lands, managed by sheriffs who collected rents. Second, feudal incidents. If an heir inherited land or if an heiress needed to marry, the king charged them massive fees for the privilege. Third was scutage, and fourth was the drastic 1207 income tax.
Let's look closer at scutage. The crucial point here is that kings actually preferred scutage over physical knight service. Cash gave the crown flexibility. Instead of relying on a reluctant feudal army of barons who might only serve for 40 days, the king could use this cash to hire loyal, full-time professional soldiers.
But by 1207, John had pushed all the traditional feudal taxes to their absolute limit. He was desperate for cash.
So he introduced a new tax, demanding 1/13 on all income and movable property. This was completely outside the normal feudal boundaries. It squeezed the population dry and bred a deep, dangerous resentment toward his rule.
Section 4. English society.
If we zoom out to the vast majority of the population in the countryside, was everyone living in a village treated equally under the law?
Far from it. Freemen had recognized legal rights. They can move around freely and even take a case to a royal court. Villains, on the other hand, who made up the vast majority, were essentially trapped. They were legally tied to the land they worked, they could not leave without permission, and they had zero legal protection against their lord's demands. A sudden fine from a lord could ruin a villain family overnight.
Towns, meanwhile, were much smaller in population, but held massive political weight. Places like London, York, and Bristol were booming centers of trade. Wealthy townspeople, called burgesses, bought charters from the king. These granted them legal freedoms rural peasants could only dream of. The crown loved towns because they generated incredible amounts of taxable wealth.
Section 5. The Jewish communities.
This brings us to a group of people who existed entirely outside the traditional feudal structure. What exactly was their legal status if they didn't fit into that chain of command?
They were legally classified as the personal property of the king. Because they were barred from owning land and excluded from most trades, they were forced into money lending. This was a vital economic role, since the church actually forbade Christians from charging interest. Being the king's property meant the crown protected them, but only so it could tax them relentlessly.
That resentment over debt, mixed with intense religious hostility, led to horrific violence. During Richard's coronation in September 1189, a Jewish delegation was attacked, sparking violence that spread across the country. Then in March 1190, a mob surrounded Clifford's Tower in York. Around 150 Jewish people died there, many taking their own lives rather than facing the murderous crowd outside.
How did the crown react to this kind of mass violence?
The crown's reaction was purely financial. Richard fined the perpetrators. He didn't do this out of a sense of moral outrage for the murders, but because the Jewish communities were a royal asset. Their deaths literally meant the king lost out on revenue.
Under King John, the financial exploitation only grew worse. He imposed heavy, arbitrary taxes known as tollages. He squeezed the Jewish communities so ruthlessly that by the end of his reign, many were completely financially broken.
Section 6. Essential exam connections.
So how do you use all this to get top marks on your GCSEs? Rote memorization just isn't enough. You need to link these concepts together. Show the examiner that you understand how the machine actually worked. For example, link feudal obligations to the king's revenue streams. Notice how scutage evolved from a feudal duty into a flexible cash source. Contrast Richard's absence, which proved the administration could run itself, against John's heavy-handed presence that ended up breaking the system. Show how John's desperate need for cash, through the 1207 tax, feudal incidents, and tollages on the Jewish communities, impacted absolutely everyone.
Let's move to our final thought. I want to leave you with a provocative essay question to solidify your understanding. Why did John's constant, overbearing presence cause far more chaos and rebellion in England than Richard's entire decade of being away? Think about the leverage of forfeiture, the resentment of new taxes, and what happens when the top of the feudal hierarchy pushes the entire machine way too far. Best of luck with your revision.